All right, looks like it's top of the hour, so I guess we'll get started here. Welcome, everybody. My name is Susan Tussey, and I'm responsible for outreach here at Globus. And today we're going to have a webinar on Globus Connect Server and endpoint configuration. So I'd like to introduce Joe Bester, who's one of our software engineers who will be leading us through the presentation. And also feel free to enter in the chat if you have questions during the presentation. And we'll also have a Q&A session following the presentation. So take it away, Joe.
Hello, everyone. So today we're going to cover sort of a overview of all the different knobs and levers you can use to configure your Globus Connect Server endpoint. I'll show you this picture a few times just to sort of give you the sort of spatial image of what we're dealing with. There's uh, quite a lot on this diagram. We're not going to get into the super low details of the actual commands you're going to type to make these changes and configurations happen, but I'll at least give you an idea of what can be configured at each of these levels on the right-hand side of the endpoint, the storage gateway, and the collections, and sort of help you understand how all these policies that you can set and configure will interact with each other so that you can configure the endpoint how you need. So we're going to start here with the endpoint. The data transfer nodes are the sort of physical machines that the Globus Connect Server software is running on, and each of those will appear identical as sort of service nodes for the endpoint. So we're not going to talk too much about how those are configured. There's an installation guide that'll kind of walk you through all that online, and I'll have links at the very end of the presentation to where to find that. But we'll talk about like what the endpoint configuration options are. Okay. So there's a few different pieces in the endpoint configuration: the ownership, subscription, network use, metadata, DNS name, and role. So these are the sort of big picture things that you can set when you're configuring your endpoint. Some of them you'll need to decide before you begin. Some of these you'll be able to update as you configure your endpoint and you realize something isn't quite right. And I'm going to try to cover all these so you'll have at least an idea of what you're being asked to configure and what makes sense as an option for that. Okay. So the first thing that you'll have to do is set an endpoint owner. That's part of the Globus Connect Server endpoint setup command. Is you have to pick an account that will administer the account or the endpoint. There are a few different main sort of approaches to this. In all these cases, the administrator has to be some identity that the Globus Auth service knows about. So we federate most identity providers that you might use at your university or Google or GitHub or whatever you're using. But there are a few different ways to pick what account is actually the endpoint owner. And the endpoint owner has sort of a unique role in that when all else fails, that account is able to administer the endpoint. So if you don't have a subscription, you can't create other roles, and this will be the only account that's able to do any administration tasks related to the endpoint configuration. So one option is to just have your admin log in with their account in Globus, use the regular, your university or organizational login system to create a token and use that, which is fine if you have one admin. If that admin sticks around, you're good. When the admin retires, there is a way to change the owner. It's not super convenient, but it's possible. But if you have more than one person that might have to do administrative tasks, that might not be the best option. Another option is to create a group account, either have your organizational ID department create some sort of account that you can log in using your identity provider and assign that as the owner, or you could use the Globus ID service to create some shared password that you allow your admins to deal with, which either of those may or may not run into policy problems. So it's kind of up to what your site allows. And then a third option is to, create an application credential in the web console, and then you can give each of your admins their own secret, and they can use that by setting some environment variables when they run the commands. Any of those work. It kind of depends on what your uh, administrative staff looks like, how many people will be involved in dealing with Globus, uh, and whether or not you have a subscription. Because if you have a subscription, you can create other roles that will allow you to do most of the administrative tasks. Yeah. The subscription is something that we recommend. It's kind of keeps Globus going. It allows quite a number of premium features, guest collections, which allow users to create their own views of data and share that with other users of the Globus systems. Connectors, which are what we call the different storage types that Globus Connect Server can support, such as S3, HPSS, Dropbox. There are quite a large number of those. And each of those is subscription covered, except for the basic POSIX one that uses the file system API. Network use allows you to tune how many connections are being used in data transfers. And high assurance allows you to configure your endpoint so that some collections have a higher level of security. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means when we get to the section on storage gateways. So network use, we're going to see it here at the endpoint level, and we'll see it again later down the line when we're talking about storage gateways as well. There are basically three different predefined types of network use: normal, minimal, aggressive. To set anything other than normal, you'll need to have a subscription, and they will be used by the transfer service to determine how many concurrent and parallel data channels are used. There's also a custom one where you set your own limits to that. And for the purpose of Globus, the words concurrency and parallelism sound very similar in what they might mean. In this context, concurrency is the number of data transfer processes running. So that might be if you have a really large transfer task, you might have half of the files being transferred by one process and then half transferred by another process. Those would be concurrent processes. And then within each of those processes, there's parallelism, which is the number of parallel data channels that you would have for each of those files that's being transferred. And as I mentioned, these can also be set on the storage gateway. But when you set this at your endpoint, it's something you can change later on. For some storage gateways, it might make sense to have different values than the defaults. But typically, if you're using Globus with your endpoint and some other endpoint, Globus is going to take a look at what network use is available on both of them to decide how much concurrency and parallelism to use. So it doesn't overwhelm the smaller system or just waste resources on the higher system. So the next set of configuration is the endpoint metadata, which is there to help you find the endpoint when you're using the Globus search functionality. There's an endpoint name, a description, some contact information, an organization department, and those are just a way for you to sort of publish information, and those are weighted in the search results so that when someone types in your university name or your organizational name, they might more likely find the correct endpoint quickly instead of having it be down a few pages. So more information is always the search results. Okay. Since the endpoint is providing a set of network resources, we have to have some sort of DNS name by default. The Globus Connect Server setup will set it up to use some random bits of numbers and letters at .data.globus.org. If you have, an IT department that allow you to create, subdomains and get certificates, you can use those to replace that random name as something that actually reflects your organization name. And that'll help both in the search results to make it sure that people are seeing the correct endpoints, but also will make it so that the users will see that, oh yeah, this is run by my organization and not by somebody who's claiming to be my organization. In order to do this, you'll need to provide the name as well as the certificate and key, either provide the data or a pointer to where they exist on your file system, and then the endpoint will use those as the domain that it's publishing for contacting the GCS Manager API. If you have a wildcard domain, then all the collections will be created as subdomains of that domain. If you just configure it as a standalone domain, it'll just be the GCS Manager API. And then finally, roles, which is another you need a subscription for. There are a few different roles. The owner role, which there is only one of, which is the person that you use to, or the account that you use to create the initial endpoint. But you can also create additional administrators that would have the ability to run the administrative commands to change the configuration of the endpoint. There's activity managers, which are allowed to use the web console to see what's going on so that they can help users and then or actually cancel jobs and pause jobs. And then the activity monitor, which allows them to just see what's going on. All right, so that's sort of generally what you configure at the endpoint level. And there's a command, Globus Connect Server endpoint update that allows you to change all those things. So the next sort of level of granularity is the storage gateway, which provides sort of all the configuration that you need to be able to access some type of data storage. So in this example endpoint here, we have 3 different storage gateways. There's POSIX 1, which is a high insurance one. There's POSIX 2, and then there's this Amazon S3 one. So in these cases, there are different types of policies that can be configured. Some of them are common, but then some of them are more specific. So we're going to kind of sort of take a look at all of the ones that cover all of the storage gateway types, and then we'll have a link to the more specific configuration for the different connectors, because there are a lot of different ways that those things will need to be configured. So for the storage gateway, there's a few classes of configuration. There's the sort of the who question about who can access data on this storage gateway. There's the what data question, which is what paths are allowed to be are collections able to access and with what permissions. And then there's a few security things related to high assurance. There's a way to override the network use, which I'll talk about a little bit later about why you would want to do that, as well as a bunch of connector specific policies. So for the user policies, there are kind of 3 main steps to configuring your endpoint. One, or for a storage gateway, one is the domains that you allow users to authenticate with to access the endpoint. So if you have, a university setting, you might allow users from your university only to access data on this system. Then you could require them to log into Globus using an identity that uses a name from that organization's identity provider. The mapping is a layer that translates the Globus auth identity information and turns it into some connector specific username so that it can use that to access data. So for a POSIX file system, that would change your user at university.edu into just the username. For something like Box or Google Drive, it might convert it into some account name used in that particular storage gateway. And it kind of depends on the connector on what the shape of the username is and how those are mapped from domains. And it's possible for any storage gateway to allow multiple domains. If you have like a student's all bunched together in one subdomain and all of your staff in another domain, then you would have to create a mapping that deals with both of those types of identities. There's a whole nother talk about how to configure this, and there'll be a link at the end of this one. Finally, there's the users allow and deny, which after the mapping occurs, allow you to choose if there are specific users that you want to enable access via Globus or deny access via Globus. You might have some sort of administrative ones that you don't want accessing Globus, or you might want to restrict it to certain POSIX groups. That would be the type of policy that you would use here that will allow you to restrict who can access after they've already authenticated, after they've been mapped to a local account name. Can they still access this data? The next step is the path restrictions, which are the what data can be seen via collections. There's 3 types of permissions that Globus Connect Server supports, which are read-only, read-write, and no access, and it's all based on a path prefix. So you can say that, some directories are going to be visible in Globus and some are not. This is what allows you to do that. And then once you've done that, any collections created will be restricted to only seeing those particular paths. If there's no access, then it's not at all visible on any collection using that storage gate. High assurance is a premium feature that you might use if you had medical or personal identifying information that you require certain restrictions on who can access this particular data. What it does is it enforces session-based timeouts on all data transfers. So in order to create a transfer task, you must have logged in within this current session, within this current timeout, or it will require you to log in again. It also includes the option of requiring your identity provider to assert that the user logged in with some multi-factor authentication device, and also includes enhanced logging so that whenever there is any data transfers, you will know exactly which accounts were involved in that and what files were accessed. And then network use, again, it's the same concepts as before with parallelism and concurrency. However, for some of the storage gateways, it makes sense to use a different value than you would normally use. Even if you have a great network, if you have a large number of parallel jobs going on, that may not work well. So it could be that there's some rate limiting happening in a cloud storage API. There might be some sort of tape issues where if you had multiple files being accessed, your tape system is just going to go nuts and swapping tapes around. So you can set it to some other value if you need to. And if you have some other particular storage system that's super fast that you want to really open up to the network via Globus, then that's also a possibility. And then there's a ton of connector specific policies, and those really vary by the connectors. They might include API endpoints for cloud storage, application credentials, rate limits, paths to configuration files, all kinds of different things. And they really only have meaning within the context of a particular connector. So if you look at the premium connector documentation, you'll see what policies are available there, and those are all settable. Like all the stuff that we've been talking about in this storage gateway section of the talk are all about things that you would update with the Globus Connect Server storage gateway update command. All right, so moving to the top, collections. So everything that we've seen so far, the endpoint and the storage gateways are sort of internal to the configuration of a Globus Connect Server endpoint. When you create a collection, it's something that the users can actually interact with. There are 2 types of collection. There's the mapped collection and the guest collection. The guest collection is basically what we used to call sharing in Globus before Globus Connect Server. And the idea is that a user will log in, access a mapped collection, and then provide access via as themselves to other users using Globus. So they can share some subset of the data space that's available within a collection. So within a collection configuration, the one key thing is the base path. So given a storage gateway that defines sort of how you will access data and what directories and S3 buckets are available within that storage gateway, collection is rooted at one specific path, and everything under that path that matches the path restrictions is visible in that collection. There's also metadata for collections, which is very important for users to be able to find your collections. There's a user message, which allows you to sort of communicate interesting bits of information about how to use this collection. There are security, sharing policies, and again, roles like we saw with the endpoint. And I kind of got ahead of myself on the base path, but it's the root of the virtual file system for the collection. And it's filtered by the storage gateway path restrictions so that only things that are allowed by the path restrictions are visible, and other collection paths are relative to this. So when a user visits the collection and they go to the slash directory, that will be going to the base path of the collection, which may not be the root path of the file system that the collection is hosted on. So this allows you to sort of restrict what subtree is visible for a particular collection. Metadata allows you to find a collection in addition to the same endpoint configuration, like the organization and the department and keywords. There's collection name, a description, contact information, and everything that you put in there will make it easier to find the collection. There's public and private, which was also relevant to the endpoint. I forgot to put it in that slide, but what this does is it controls how visible. It's not an access control thing, it's more of a visibility thing. If a collection is private and you try to visit this collection in the web browser and you don't have a account from the appropriate domain, you're not even going to be able to see the collection. It's just not there. So it doesn't restrict access as much as make it invisible to people who don't have any access. For a mapped collection, you can set your own DNS name if you have administrator privileges on the endpoint. So you can set the label, which is the outermost DNS name component. So it will be a subdomain of either the random name that Globus assigns, or if you have a wildcard domain name at the endpoint level, it'll be a subdomain of that. And if you could also set a fully qualified domain name independent of the endpoint's domain name if you want. So if you have, a particular endpoint that's run by the university and then a collection that's run by some specific group that has a project name that they want to use as their DNS name, your endpoint administrator can set the domain name, certificate, and key for that particular mapped collection, and it will look like it's whatever name you would like it to be. The user message and link are bits of information that are visible when you visit the web browser or the file browser in the Globus app. It'll show up right under the path, and it's just a short message. And then if you set a link, if you click on that message, it'll take you to that link. So it's useful if you want to set, this is where you have some documents about where things are located in this collection, or if you wanted to announce when the system will be unavailable on a particular date, you can put a message up there so anyone who visits the Globus web to access your collection will see, all right, this weekend it's going to be down. Don't expect my transfers to happen. Okay, there's a few security policies at the collection level. One is forcing encryption, where any transfer using Globus must use encryption. If you have a transfer task and you try to not use encryption, it will just reject the transfer task. That's automatically enabled if you're using the high assurance feature. And then there's also some options to enable or disable HTTPS access, which is another premium feature for requiring a subscription, which will allow you to directly upload or download collection files using the HTTPS protocol. So this is, you could have it so that from a portal application or from a web app, you could have a direct link to data that's hosted on that collection. And then you would log in using your Globus credentials, but then the file would be downloaded directly instead of requiring another collection to transfer the data to. You can interact with it from, your desktop or laptop machine. And then sharing policies are policies that allow you to configure what users are allowed to do with regards to sharing. So you can enable or disable guest collections. If you disable guest collections, then users will not be able to create guest collections, and there will only be the mapped collection, so that the users must log in as themselves to access the data. With the guest, if you enable guest collections, then you allow users who have access to the mapped collection to create new guest collections containing some subset of data from that mapped collections. There are path restrictions that have a similar syntax to those at the storage gateway level, but this would be to restrict what type of access users are allowed to grant with a guest collection. So you can say, yes, you can share this data, but you can only share it read-only, and you can only share these particular directories, or you can, configure however your file system layout is to say, yes, you can allow these certain directories to be written to, or these are completely inaccessible if you try to share. There's also sharing user restrictions, which operate on the local usernames, and basically you can enable some set of users to be able to create or not create guest collections. And then there are sharing policies that sort of combine the path restrictions and the user restrictions so that you can have a more narrowly focused policy, excuse me, where you can say users in this set are able to create guest collections that share these particular directories, or users in this other set are not allowed to share these directories. So it's sort of a more targeted set of sharing policies. And then there are rules that we have within these collections. So any particular collection has multiple roles. The administrator is the person who, by default, is the person who created the collection, but you can create additional administrators so that they can update or change the configuration of the collection. Activity manager is allowed to always see a collection even if it's private, and then also cancel tasks. Activity monitor is able to see all the tasks that are operating on a collection in the console, and then the access manager I think is able to see is able to see the collection and then see who's been accessing it, I think. Or see sorry.
Able to see the collection and able to set permissions.
Thank you. Okay. And I think that's the end. So there's a lot of documentation. There's lots of very specific bits of documentation in this Globus Connect Server area. I'm sort of working to try to make it a little bit more of a coherent set of documentation. And then there's also there's a YouTube section that has all the other office hours presentations. I know that there's at least some on network use, identity mappings, trying to think what other ones. I think there's one about automated deployments. So there's quite a few that will offer more insight into some of these areas that I gave information about, but not in the extremely low level details. So, but that's what I have. So I hope this was helpful and that you got some information out of it. Thank you.